Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone from the Lincoln Center of Applied Ethics and everyone from ASU for coming here and for your interest in the work of the Lincoln Center, the work of humane technology and its development, and for your interest in the kind of work that I'm trying to put together. So I'm very delighted to be here. Thank you for coming. I'm going to be presenting literally a work in progress here. So I am grateful for your engagement, but also for your patience. And the work in progress has two elements. The content of the work in progress is one element, but the form of the work in progress is another element. So one of the commitments that what we might call critical disability studies or humane technologies or STS, there are a lot of, or bioethics, one of the commitments that all of those enterprises has is to create a technology that works for as many people as possible. So in the spirit of that, we've got a lot going on here together. We just discovered that the captions are overlapping some of the captions in the PowerPoint presentation slides that I've put together. So there'll be some incoherence. But let me begin by talking a little bit more again about both the form and the content of what I'm doing here today. So all right. What I'm beginning with here is I'm trying to, as I suggested, create the most accessible communication environment that I can. And this is, I'm hoping to kind of model a set of best practices that are aspirational to create a presentation that has multiple modes of communication at play at once. And so one mode, of course, is the auditory mode. And I am committed to creating a what I call robust auditory environment here. And that comes from me shouting most of the time. And also in our Q&A, we would ideally use microphones to create the most robust auditory environment, but apparently there aren't any, which is fine. Technology and access, remember, once again, are always aspirational ideals. So no apologies, we'll just do the best we can. And I see already one of the limitations here. So what I'm showing you here is a description slide that I have put together, which replicates what is visually accessible to the people in attendance here. That is to say, my face. And there is a description that I have offered of my face for people who might not be accessing this presentation visually for one reason or another. And there are many reasons that people don't access the visual environment. So I have a description here. Rosemarie, Garland, Thomson. Pictured here is a pale-skinned, middle-aged woman with silver, chin-length, straight hair, reddish lipstick, wearing round black glasses frames and a black jacket. She's pictured here in a professional headshot taken in the living room of her apartment in San Francisco. So what I'm doing here is not introducing myself. Therefore, I don't say I'm a white woman. I don't claim my identity groups. I simply describe what is visually accessible to the people who are visually accessing the presentation. So this is I hope, modeling a best practice. I'm going to give you a little bit of an executive summary here of, we need to go back for a moment to my title slide. So the title of my presentation is A Call to Wonder, how the health humanities can make us more humane. So this is, as I said, a work in progress. So I have a slide here that is something of an executive summary, if you will, of what I'm going to present. And I always try to have as many words on the slides as I can to actually say these words to you. So I will read some of the material on the slides and I will not read some of the other material on the slides. I can also say that I will make available a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation, as well as a PDF of a much longer version of this that can be references for you, because I will have bibliographic slides in here, as well as image slides, so that you can go back if you're interested and look at some of the images, find some of the images, review whatever might be helpful for you here. So this is what I'm trying to do. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about critical and cultural disability studies theory, and I'm going to suggest that that has given us or moved toward healthcare ethics or health humanities applications. And I'll talk a little bit more about what an applied knowledge field might be. Critical disability studies is a theoretical field. Healthcare ethics and health humanities are applied fields or knowledge enterprises. So I'll make that distinction. And then I'm going to try to gesture toward STEM content, because many of you, I'm sure, read the article in the New Yorker recently about why we don't have English majors anymore. And you may have seen that, read that ASU was one of the, if you will, kind of case studies that was brought forward. And part of the article pointed out that many people, not just at ASU, but at Harvard, the other case study, as well as many universities, are majoring now in STEM subjects rather than humanities subjects. And so I wanted to try to gesture a little bit to healthcare ethics or the health humanities as a bridge, if you will, between the theoretical enterprise of cultural disability studies or critical disability studies, which is theory, and its application, and to think about that relationship and how that relates to STEM. We can talk a little bit more about that. And then to get to the topic that Elizabeth mentioned that I really am interested in, and this is a term that comes from a project, I guess, or an emphasis here at ASU that's been ongoing for a number of years regarding questions about the ethics and the future, of course, of humane technologies. So that's the kind of archaeology, if you will, of this work in progress. So a little review of some of the things that cultural and critical disability studies has brought to us. That field, which I've been involved with for a number of years, has developed social constructionist theories around disability. It has brought forward the argument that disability is not necessarily a property of physical bodies, but rather is a property of the interaction between the environment and human bodies. And this, of course, is fundamentally social constructionist theory. It's also brought forward the work of Irving Goffman in particular, who talks about stigma theory. This comes from social interactionism. So if you are a sociologist, this will make some sense to you. And again, what I'm showing you here are my citations, and they're visual citations. So I have the name of a book, often for the caption, and then a visual image of the cover of the book. And that's the way I'm trying to make this a multimodal presentation. Another contribution that critical cultural disability studies has given us is that it has presented an intersectional analysis of structural injustices. And I'm showing here an image that I really like and I show very often. It is a photograph, black and white photograph from the 1970s, I think. I'm not sure exactly when it is. And it is a protest, a march, that is carried out in the interest of disability rights. And there are some famous disability scholars and disability leaders in this photograph. Judy Humane is in this photograph, who, if you know who Judy Humane is, she just passed away a few weeks ago. We had been friends for over 20 years, so it was a huge loss to our community, but more on all that later. But a number of other people with disabilities here are in the foreground, marching in wheelchairs with canes, carrying a banner. And this is what's important. The banner says, Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And this is a quote, a direct quote from Martin Luther King, which is what the banner suggests. And I thought that this was a choreography, if you will, of intersectionality and how it operates. So it's a visual presentation of intersectionality. Intersectionality, of course, being the idea that there are multiple social identities and social systems in which we all have places and we belong to all of these systems, and they operate together multiply in any lived life or any social circumstance. Another element of critical and cultural disability studies is to look at the history of eugenics. And this, of course, has a great deal to do with science and technology studies. For those of you who need a little review, eugenics is the science of improving humanity. It begins, as many of you know, in the late 19th century. It's a term that is coined by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, and this is a eugenics tree logo from 1925. I really love this because it says everything about how eugenics operates in a visual representation. It says eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. So this is the rise of the concept of the individual, the rugged individual, the heroic individual, taking control of human evolution through science. And then the root of this tree has a variety of different academic and knowledge enterprises: sociology, religion, genetics, biology, psychology, medicine, surgery, psychiatry. So this, and it's very important to understand this, eugenics was a product of what we call the progressive era because it was imagined as being human progress, that is to say, improving humanity. So there's much to talk about, and we can, about what are sometimes called the old eugenics and the new eugenics. I'm showing you here an image on the left from 1893 of these anthropometric composite figures done by Dudley Sargent of a normative man and a normative woman. And these statues show what I called in some of my previous work normates. So they are gender normative, they are ability and disability normative, if you will. They are normative, they are racially normative. And so they pull together what might be understood as the intersectional aspect of normalcy as it is defined in eugenics. So the old eugenics begins more or less in 1883, and I want to say continues to 1946. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested in that. In 1946 is when we have the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, where Hitler's personal physician, Karl Brandt, is executed for his role in euthanizing disabled people and conducting experiments on people who had not given their consent in the Holocaust to be experimented on. That's a long story. Many people have argued, many philosophers, that we have something called a new eugenics, which begins in 1946. It's a eugenics of autonomy and consent. And it's a eugenics that is based on the idea of improving the humanity through science and technology, medical technology, improving humanity in general, but people exercising their own autonomy in participating in this enterprise rather than having this be state-sponsored as it was during the Nazi era before 1946. So I'm showing an image here of what I call the normal or the normate template for making better babies through gene editing. This is something many of us have had a few things to say about. This is a baby who is the baby equivalent of these 1893 anthropometric composite figures. And this baby is made better with having a higher IQ. And I might add that IQ is not a thing. It is a eugenic concept that was developed in the early eugenics era to try to identify people understood as feeble-minded for possible sterilization. This improved baby would have 20/20 vision, a low risk of a whole bunch of different diseases, perfect pitch in terms of hearing, perfect feet, and I think this is interesting. No baldness is what is, we can take those sex-linked characteristics that are understood as flaws, and there's a lot to say about all these. So this is just an introduction. The other contribution, if you will, that cultural and critical disability studies has given us, and there are many, is some work on care ethics. And I'm showing you a picture of a book here by my colleague, Jackie Leach Scully, called Disability Bioethics, Moral Bodies, Moral Difference, which I would recommend. And a photograph here of the bioethicist Jackie Leach Scully, who runs a bioethics center in, I think, New South Wales, somewhere around Sydney. I'm not exactly sure right now where. And I'm offering a definition here of care ethics, which comes from feminism, but it comes from a lot of places at the same time. It also comes from religious studies. But here's a definition of care ethics. Care ethics asserts that there is moral significance in the fundamental elements of relationships and dependencies in human life. And one reason that I'm invoking care ethics here, of course, is that we are together here in an ethics center. And care ethics is a particularly important consideration, if you will, when we're talking about the development of humane technologies. So I will continue with care ethics a little bit more for the rest of my presentation, but let me back up and start presenting some of the images to you and some of the propositions of my work in progress here. So I want to move now to the idea of narrative, which is extremely important in the kind of work that I do and the kind of health humanities or healthcare ethics. And to think about story and the work of story as a kind of knowledge that is not counting and measuring knowledge, but is knowledge more anchored in lived human experience in time and space. So disability and illness stories are an opportunity to explore, redefine, and make new stories about what it means to be human. This is one of my major assertions for my own work. And I'm showing here an image to you that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. This is a piece of art done by a disabled artist about disability in the world. And that's what I'm going to talk to you mostly about during my presentation here. This is a piece called Olympia. You may realize that this is, of course, a allusion to the Olympia painting done by Manet. This is called Olympia, and so now we understand that. It's by an artist from UC Berkeley named Catherine Sherwood, and what we have presented to us here is Olympia. There's much to be said about this. If you want to go look at Catherine Sherwood's website, you can see much more of this work. This is Olympia in the recognizable pose, but this has been hacked, if you will, by Catherine Sherwood, who is an artist who had a stroke well into her career as a painter. And the stroke forced her to do two things. It forced her to stop painting with the hand she painted with and start painting with the other hand, because the stroke paralyzed one of her hands. I don't remember which one it was, but also it yielded new images to her of herself, and that is MRIs of her brain. And so she transformed her work. And this is an example of these transformed paintings, so that the MRI image of her brain, the X-ray of her brain, becomes the face of Olympia here. And of course, then she inflects the traditional Manet's Olympia with a little brace on its leg in the same kind of pose. So it's a really interesting allusion, a reference to classical art, a hack, if you will. I like that concept. Okay, so the health humanities, I want to present to you this concept that the health humanities gives us stories about human diversity, human solidarity, and the human need for care. So that's what I want to emphasize is diversity, solidarity, and care, and pull those together in what we might think of as, I don't know, the work of this paper. So this slide now moves to bioethics. And this slide is a new kind of slide that I have been developing, and I'm calling it a citational slide. I'm calling it a visual bibliography because I want to make reference to two important articles. Now, you don't have to think about reading this because you can go and get that later, but I want to explain these two important articles. So I'm showing an image of my colleague who is a wheelchair using doctor at Harvard Medical School, Lisa Izoni. And she, along with 12 other colleagues, you know how that these medical things have all these people on them? She's the lead author for these two articles that were published, one of them in 2020, another one in 2021, so quite recent, in Health Affairs, a journal I'm not too familiar with. And the first one is called Physicians' Perceptions of People with Disability and Their Healthcare. The second is called U.S. Physicians' Knowledge about the Americans with Disabilities Act and Accommodation of Patients with Disability. What Lisa and her colleagues did is that they went to doctors and said, do you have any patients with disabilities? How do you feel about having patients with disabilities? What are they like? Do you want more patients with disabilities? And in short, what she discovered was that no, they didn't have a lot of patients. No, they didn't really want any more, because they didn't really know quite what to do with these patients with disabilities. Maybe they made them a little nervous for one reason or another. So it wasn't very conclusive in this way, but it was a kind of alert about how people with disabilities don't quite fit into a lot of physicians' care situations, let's say it that way. The second was a follow-up where they went and asked a number of questions to physicians. Again, I don't know about these studies too well. I don't know if they're the same physicians because I'm an English teacher. What they asked these doctors was, what do you know about asking your patients for what accommodations they need? What do you know about the Americans with Disabilities Act and disability? I'm sure they didn't say disability justice, but asking them a question, and the answer in general was not much. And so this lays the groundwork, in my view, for a need to do a lot of work in healthcare ethics around disability, a lot of training, if you will. And the training, and I'm going to suggest this more fully a little bit later, might be in the form, and I've made the argument for this, of disability cultural competence. And we can talk a lot about that. There are a lot of questions. Cultural competence in medical education is a very controversial kind of enterprise, but again, more on that later. So I have made, this is another bibliographic slide. I've made a couple of arguments. And so these are, again, citations that might be helpful if you're interested in this. One is I wrote an article called The Case for Conserving Disability, which was really very much of a provocation that argued that we really want to have disabled people in the world and that we really ought to try to conserve disability. I was using the analogy of biodiversity conservation that we use in thinking about plants and animals and anthropological groups, and saying that perhaps we ought to think about doing this with disability, people with disabilities. I'm not sure how far that went, but anyway, it's out there. Lisa and I also published a very short piece recently, 2021, in the American Journal of Bioethics on disability cultural competence. It's mercifully short, by the way, if you really want to go read it. These open peer commentaries are always short. So if you want to know more, there's the bibliography. And I want to invoke one more contribution that has been kind of come in sideways to critical and cultural disability studies that I will talk about for the rest of the time that we're here together. And that is the critique of the modern individualism and the lament of disenchantment. Some of you may know a lot about this already, so I'll be as brief as I can be for those of you who need a little bit of a review. I'm showing here an image of a really quite wonderful book, in my view, by Jane Bennett, who is an historian, called The Enchantment of Modern Life. And in brief, this is a narrative of the development of modernity that says we lived in an enchanted era in which wonder as a affect, human affect, had a great deal of purchase. And then modernity came along and changed that for a number of reasons and disenchanted the world. This is a complicated and a fraught narrative, but it's an interesting narrative you may be familiar with. It is woven into a much more well-known conversation that comes a great deal from philosophers about the lament, as I said, the critique of modern individualism that says we are basically all bowling alone, if you will, and that we have lost our capacities to be in community and in communion with one another, because the idea of the Cartesian individual self has ascended, and that's the characteristic of modernity. I'm giving you a very oversimplified version of these things, but I think most of us know something about this. And I'm showing here an image of Charles Taylor, the philosopher's book, called Sources of the Self, where this argument is put forward. It's put forward in a lot of different places. I listed a number of philosophers that I myself work with. I don't mean them as people, but their material. And that is Max Weber, of course, who talks about rationalization. Hannah Arendt, who I use a lot, actually, who writes, of course, The Human Condition, about many other things. Charles Taylor, who I mentioned. Alistair MacIntyre, a less known philosopher who is very critical of modern individualism. And Jürgen Habermas, which I use a great deal, and Jürgen Habermas writes a really important book in my world about the future of humanity. There's a lot of future of humanity language that comes out of philosophy. And more recently, a very interesting philosopher named Carter Snead, who has a book called What It Means to Be Human, which I think is a very interesting book. So these are just some of the sources that I'm using in my own current work on what I'm calling wonder here, that I'm going to try to tell you a little bit more about. So I discovered a very interesting study. I don't know what to make of these two studies. They were carried out by a person named Gail Geller at Johns Hopkins University. I think this person's a sociologist. I may have this a little bit wrong. Maybe a sociologist of science, in which Gail Geller and her teams went around to doctors again, asking these doctors how much wonder existed in the relationships they had between themselves and their patients. And the answer was not much, but they'd like more. So that was the first article, The Cultivation of Wonder in the Pre-Medical Learning Environment. The second was the development and validation of a capacity for wonder scale to use in educational settings. This kind of thing, people in my world don't know anything about how to do, but it strikes me that this is a really interesting opportunity for the kinds of collaborations, interdisciplinary work that can be done, that somebody can come up with a capacity for wonder scale in education settings, know how to make it. I mean, it has numbers in it and things, and then know what to do with it, where I just yammer on all day long about pictures and stories. So I think that there's some possibility for interesting collaboration around modernity, the critique of individualism, care ethics, and wonder, which is what I want to talk about a little bit more. And this work suggests that the affective work of wonder, in other words, the emotional work of wonder, these are terms that Galer's work uses, perspective shifting. And also there is emotional reawakening that comes from experiencing wonder in the medical setting. So much work to be done. I want to then spend the rest of the time that we have here together giving you some examples of what I call wonder in the health humanities. Where do we find wonder in the health humanities? Well, we find it in literature, we find it in performance, we find it in art, we find it in design, and I'm going to give you some images. I have a much longer presentation, as I mentioned, that has many, many more examples, because I am, like we all are, in love with my images, with my pictures. And so there are many more of those if you want to get the PDF of that longer version. So let me give you some examples. I want to say first that disability wonder, which is something I want to talk about, wondering at disability, crosses all genre, media, time periods, aesthetic themes, and cultures. This is one of the main premises of cultural and critical disability studies, is disability is everywhere. This comes from Douglas Bainton, a disability historian. What you need to do is know how to look for it, know how to find it, and that disability is in every family and disability is in every life. And this is really, these are crucial claims. So I'm going to be showing you this in an invitation to notice disability in the context of wonder. So I've tried to find some images, starting with that one I showed you of Catherine Sherwood's work. Here is I have to do the math on this, what, 3,500-year-old vase that I'm not sure it's an amphora. I'm not sure where it comes from, but it's a very familiar Grecian urn. Here we are with, we're back to Keats, which shows a very small person, someone with what we would think now of as the medical category achondroplasia, that is 3,500 years old on this vase. So what the representational work of this does is hard to understand, but there is. I've been talking for 30 minutes. Okay, a few more images here. This is a character that I have been working with. This is an armless calligrapher, armless and legless calligrapher from the 18th century named Matthew Buchinger. And he was one of the marvels, or one of the prodigies, who made his living as a calligrapher and a performer, if you will. And he has done this self-portrait, which he shows you his outfit, his costuming as an armless and legless calligrapher. And he has done the calligraphy of his own hair. And in his hair it's calligraphy. I don't remember whether it's the Lord's Prayer inside of his hair, but this is part of the genre of marvels and prodigies that performed in really in the pre-modern period. A painting here by Claude Monet, who is, of course, a very well-known impressionist whose late works become much, much more impressionistic because, of course, his late works are painted when he's blind. And so he's painting what he's seeing in the sense of fuzziness, which we now interpret as an aesthetic evolution rather than a devolution because of his blindness. Everyone will be late life. Their picture done by Catherine Sherwood. This is After Ong. From 2014. This is another Venus, which takes the Venus of Ong and hacks it or inflects it with, again, the face that comes from the images of her own brain. And so every piece of work she does has these images, these x-rays basically in them. And this is just another example. And this one has a prosthetic arm holding a peacock fan, which is really quite beautiful. Again, in this Venus pose that is the odalisque pose that's so common in 19th century female nudes. This is a really wonderful piece. This is a photograph that is on display in the permanent collection at the Wellcome Collection in London. This is a photograph from the 1990s done by Alexa Wright. It is I'm not going to get this right. It's a photograph she created. She made it. I mean, she took pictures and then she made it. And this is a photograph of a woman who has phantom limb syndrome. And what Alexa Wright did is to create a digital image, is that the right word, that represented the lived and felt experience of this woman. So this is not a picture of this woman's hand, but this is a picture of how the woman experiences her left hand, which is on the arm of a chair. It's unusual looking. And there's a series of these. So this woman is seated in a chair with her in a kind of typical photographic portrait with this rather unusual hand, which is created as a representation of the felt experience of her own embodiment. This is a piece of work that is done by Jessie Park, a woman with autism. So this is part of the art of neurodiversity. It's called The Structure of Flame, and we see a rather interesting flame here that the title here is Chemistry of Combustion and Illumination. So just to point out that there's a whole genre of what might be called autistic art or neurodiverse art. I want to introduce the term neurodiversity, which is a really very important disability category of body minds. This is a wonderful image of Frida Kahlo's prosthetic leg, which shows us a great deal about disability art and disability design. And we have a red boot here that is really a kind of early 20th century kind of prosthetic, not too different from the one that Franklin Roosevelt wore, which is really a very moving prosthetic if you take a look at that. They're braces, so it's called prosthetic, but anyway, it has this beautiful red boot with a dragon on it along the foot. And of course, it's important that we recognize Frida Kahlo and many of these artists as disabled artists, even though that narrative of them has not been has not been generally put forward, but this Frida Kahlo piece allows us to do that. I wanted to share this with you. It's a piece of haptic sculpture, haptic meaning that which is tactile. So it is designed not necessarily to be looked at, although it does have a visual component, but it is a piece of art, piece of sculpture designed to be touched. And of course, most sculpture is designed or is displayed, and we are forbidden from touching it. So this looks like a kind of rack made out of bamboo, and it looks like a bookshelf in some ways. And at the top there is some rope that is coiled, and you can't move the rope around. I saw this in Boston somewhere. And at the bottom, I love this. There's a whole tangle, if you will, of these strips of rawhide, like a dog would chew on. That's what they really are. And this is a piece of sculpture that is particularly accessible to blind people and their service animals. So it's designed to be touched, and I guess designed to be chewed on as well, which is really wonderful, in my view, innovative kind of art. So this is haptic sculpture. Another example, this is a colleague of mine who's a designer. She has very unusual hands. They're actually a little bit like my hands, only different. And she has very unusual feet as well. Her name is Sandy Yee, and she has designed clothing that is bespoke for her own body. So she's wearing here some beautiful knitted gloves that have tassels on them. They're a little bit difficult to describe, but they're really quite beautiful. And So this is part of the bespoke fashion for people with disabilities, because of course, many of us need to wear clothing that is bespoke, designed for us and our bodies. There is a great deal of really innovative work. I'm showing you here a prosthetic leg called the Stereo Leg, done by the Alternative Limb Project. Go to that website if you want to see some really interesting prosthetic limbs, arms and legs, that are designed to be looked at. They're not designed to be hidden. They are designed to be showed off, and these are fabulous ones. They're bejeweled and bedazzled and everything, and they're really fabulous. So this one leg with these fabulous 6-inch white sandals is very beautiful, with a whole lot of interesting things. I'm showing you the cover here of Ilya Kaminsky's book, because deaf poetry and protactile poetry, ASL poetry, ASL literature is an extraordinarily vibrant field of literature. These are poems written by the deaf poet Ilya Kaminsky, and the title of the book is Deaf Republic. So I would recommend this. It won the National Book Award. Okay, I'm at 40 minutes. Let me just mention a few things, and I'll scroll through here and take a few more minutes to finish up. So in the genre of music, we have the genre of the blind Black piano players or musicians, Charles Wiggins, Ray Charles, Stevie Wonder. That's one example. A portrait here by Vincent van Gogh, of course, because self-portraits, disability self-portraits are very, very important genre of self-representation. I'm going to stay for a minute with this portrait done by Riva Lehrer, who's a very well-known contemporary artist. She's someone born with spina bifida, which of course is a condition that we understand is not particularly compatible with having a good life. And it's a condition that is tested for quite assiduously in the reproductive economy. And so Riva Lehrer is an artist and painting this beautiful picture of herself in a pool in which she shows her back, which of course has survived multiple surgeries, as anyone who has spina bifida or anyone born with any kind of an orthopedic disability, including me, has had in our experience. So this is a really wonderful portrait. Go look at Riva Lehrer's work. The breast cancer movement has produced a number of photographs of self-portraits, photographic self-portraits of women who've had mastectomies in a kind of, breast cancer pride movement. And so I'm showing some here images of women who have are displaying proudly their mastectomy scars and this is part of, again, the genre of wonder, if you will. I'm quite fascinated with this recent portrait that has emerged of my colleague, Salman Rushdie, who you may know survived a knife attack. And this very mugshot-ish picture that I'm showing you here, I think is really very powerful, in which he has the mark of disability here. That is to say, glasses, which one side has dark glasses, which is part of the costuming of blindness, and the other side are clear because he's blind in one eye. And you see the kind of stab wounds that are on the side of his face. So this transformed Rushdie is a really, I think, a very powerful and interesting recent photograph. Toulouse-Lautrec, of course, is a disabled artist who was involved in the representation of dance. There are several other dance images here that I wanted to share with you. This is David Toole, the legless dancer who dances on his hands, and his movement vocabulary is really rewriting dance because it has been imagined that legs are the essential properties of dance, but David Toole is showing us that dancing on arms instead of legs is an alternative movement vocabulary. Jerron Herman, who is a dancer with cerebral palsy. I'm going to move away. This are two narratives, collections of narratives about disability, a book I was involved in editing, which collects the essays on disability written by people with disabilities. It was in the New York Times for 2 years running, and a more recent book called Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong. These are stories of disability written by people with disabilities. I'm going to share with you two things in conclusion. One is a project I'm working on Wonder, in which I'm looking at sacred images of care and care ethics, and just talk a little bit about this. There's a lot of interesting work done in disability and theology, or disability and religious studies, much of which comes from a book called The Disabled God that I'm showing you here, written by my colleague, former colleague, she has died now, Nancy Easlin. It's Liberation Theology of Disability, in which she makes the suggestion that the wounded, in Christianity, in the Christian tradition, the wounded body of Jesus on the cross is a opportunity for people to identify with a disabled divine figure, and that this can be a liberatory identification. And there's quite a bit of interesting work. I met Gil Stafford recently, who I think might be out somewhere in the virtual world here, who introduced me to a book that he has published called Meditations on Blue Jesus. His sister, Dinah Stafford, is someone with cognitive disabilities who painted this blue Jesus, it's Jesus on a cross, in 1998 when she was a participant in the Artworks program at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And so this is, again, a citation of the book that Gil has published, if you want to take a look at that. So I'm going to show you a few images, as I said, of something I'm working on, and that is the iconography of the Pietà, which is the figure of the mother of Jesus, Mary, holding the crucified Jesus on her lap. And I'm suggesting that these sacred images of care relations call on wonder to affirm dignity. So this is an argument that I've made. And I want to talk about choreographies of body care here that honor mortal human bodies. This is how I'm calling on Hannah Arendt, who has an early piece that she calls I Want You to Be, which I think is a very moving, very much like Emmanuel Levinas's call that he understands through the relationship of viewing the face of the other, if you have followed that. So I'm showing you here, of course, the famous Pietà that is imprinted in a way on anyone's retina who has been educated in Western culture. And this, of course, is Michelangelo's Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, again, of the Mother of God, the Mother of Jesus, Mary, holding the crucified Son on her lap. So it's often understood as a representation of lamentation, of sorrow, but I want to suggest that it is a representation of the sacred work of body care, which of course has been assigned to women throughout all of human history. And there are a number of allusions to this Pietà that I have been studying. This one is particularly moving to me. It's done by the Australian artist Sam Jinks in 2007. It's called Still Life or Pietà, where we have a really interesting rewriting of this relationship. So you have the same bodily choreography here of the seated figure holding on his lap. In this case, it's a kind of a middle-class man in a jacket, holding a figure that is in a way ungendered, of a very, very old person who is dying or dead on his lap. And of course, because of the position, because of the bodily choreography, we have an allusion here to a whole tradition of representation of sorrow and lamentation, but also a tradition about body care. made modern. So there are a number of these. This is a Pietà by Tylon Sawyer from 2018, in which we have, again, the same choreography of the body. We have a Black woman, maybe a mother, but a woman at least, holding on her lap a child, a Black child who has a Black hoodie on and maybe Black pants, and is holding, again, this figure on her lap in the same choreography of holding that we see in Michelangelo's Pietà. And in the background, of course, what we have is an American flag. So there's a great deal of irony here. And we have this figure, this mother figure, looking straight out at the audience with an expression of accusation on her face. So there's a different kind of message, but this connects to a long tradition of what I call these choreographies of bodily care. And this is the last one that I want to show you. And this is one that I have found recently. It's done by the American photographer Robert Andy Coombs. And I want to suggest that this is a really interesting Pietà as well of bodily care. It is a pale-skinned man on a couch. This is a nude. He's reclining on a couch, much like Catherine Sherwood's reclining figures. And behind him, embracing him, is another person who is probably nude as well, and who has very dark skin. So we have an interesting contrast here, a very pale skin and very dark skin in this embrace. And of course, at the very center of interest of this nude, which is quite arresting, is a tube, a catheter that is going into the abdomen, which is a medical treatment, of course, of this man. So we have, and he has a leg bag on. So this is a medical photograph that is at the same time what I want to call a Pietà, or a scene of holding. So this is, I think, what we could bring forward as really interesting work that we can call the healthcare humanities. So there's more. I want to end with one example, and that is some of the artwork that's been done of people with Down syndrome. And to point you in this slide to some articles about the ethical issue that people with Down syndrome are being identified preborn people, or before birth, prenatally. This is a very controversial kind of thing I'm trying to say here, so just give me a minute on this. Who are being identified prenatally through genetic testing, and often with selective termination, so that worldwide, people with Down syndrome, about 90%, it is assumed, anywhere from 85 to 90% of fetuses that are identified with a risk for Down syndrome are being terminated. So whatever you think of this, it's a very interesting and important ethical issue. And the most important ethical issue here is that when the genetic test for Down syndrome was developed in the 1960s, people with Down syndrome had a very high risk for low quality of life. Now, people with access to medical and economic resources with Down syndrome can have very, very good lives. And we are still terminating these kinds of people at a rate of 85 to 9% worldwide. This was an article about people with Down syndrome and their families in Denmark that was in the Atlantic magazine that's worth taking a look at as far as we have an issue here. And I will close with a couple of images of some artwork that has to do with the communities of people with Down syndrome. So this is a portrait that I find very moving, done by an artist in Tucson, whose name is Chris Rush. And it is a photograph, it's a painting, a portrait, done with Conte crayon of a young woman who seems identifiably a person with Down syndrome. And she has this elegant turban on, which it looks like a beach towel maybe, or a bath towel. And I want to suggest that this portraiture, I've done a lot of work in this area, calls forth some of the conventions of portraiture, in which the portrait is supposed to represent someone with great dignity. So we have a Renaissance portrait here that I'm showing on the right, and a portrait of Queen Victoria, also here with these same profile poses. And so this particular pose that Chris Rush has used invests this person with great dignity. And I think it works really well to give us an illustration of what the cultural work of representation can be, and to invoke a term that I have used, and that is dignity maintenance. And I want to suggest that it's very difficult for people with disabilities, and for many people in the world, but I'm talking about people with disabilities, to maintain the kind of dignity that is necessary in order to live the kinds of lives that we would expect and want to live. And I will close with a important American artist whose name is Judith Scott, whose dates are 1943 to 2005. Judith Scott was born with Down syndrome and cognitive disabilities of some kind. She never spoke, but she, at a sheltered workshop in Berkeley, began to pick up fibers and yarn and wrap, and wrapped and wrapped and wrapped, and made an entire corpus of really important sculptural work. This is a photograph, a black and white photograph that's quite well known, of her hugging or holding, if you will. I want to think of this as some kind of a holding choreography, maybe a pietà of some sort, in which Judith Scott is holding her own sculpture here. It's very beautiful. The scale is quite different here, the bodily choreography, but still it's a pietà in some way. And I'll show you an image here of one of Judith Scott's pieces that was displayed at Davidson College in 2009, in which she's wrapped a chair and a basket and a wheel from a bicycle or a wheelchair, and wrapped and wrapped and wrapped it. And so I want to say that what we ought to do is, if somebody really wants to think about the future of humane technology, somebody ought to buy one of Judith Scott's sculptures and put it either in a medical school or in some flashy technology building on some university campus. And I will leave you with Judith Scott. Thank you.